Zach.
Well, hey, I'm Zach Herchen. I'm here with composer David Froom, and we're actually in his house in southern Maryland, which is very cool. It's really pretty around here.
Oh yeah, it's nice. Thanks. It's, I don't get credit for the environment.
Thanks for making the Chesapeake.
Yes, yeah. It's a little slip of land that's between the Potomac one side and the Chesapeake on the other.
Mm-hmm.
A tiny little peninsula, maybe about half the size of Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
So not quite as wide, not quite as long.
Yeah.
But it's not on the way to anywhere.
Right. Well, you moved here from New York City, right?
Yeah, well, actually, I had studied in New York and had bounced around. I grew up in California, studied at Berkeley and then at University of Southern California. Mm-hmm. So I had both the Northern California and the Southern California experience. And then came east and studied in New York. Met my wife there, the pianist Eliza Garth. And but my first teaching job was in Utah, so I got a chance to experience what they call the Intermountain West. Then we found a position where I could teach full-time and she could teach part-time down here at a little college called St. Mary's College of Maryland. Probably the only St. Mary's in the world that's a public college.
Hmm. Yeah.
It was named because of the first settlers back in the 1600s. There were Catholics in England that needed a place to go because Virginia was welcoming only to the Protestants. So they wanted to make sure everyone knew that this was a welcoming place for Catholics. So where they landed, they called St. Mary's City, and the river they came in, they called the St. Mary's River, and then they named so this is St. Mary's County. And
Yeah.
the college is at the site of the first settlement, so that's why it has the name.
Do you feel more at home out here than in a big city?
That's kind of hard to say. I mean, a lot of my colleagues at the college, we all say that the first 10 years we were here, we expected that we would be gone within a few years. Just because
Yeah.
it's kind of a hard, it is kind of a hard adjustment. In a way, I grew up in a small town north of San Francisco. So
Okay.
I'm living in a small town south of Washington, D.C., about the same distance.
Yeah, so it's not that different.
We may be doomed to repeat our lives that way. But I think that I'm probably happiest being close to a city. I wish maybe I were a few miles closer. We're contemplating a move to.
Do you think that's like the musician-composer thing, that you
Yeah.
feel like you have to be near things happening?
There's something very odd about being the only composer within about a 50-mile radius.
Do people know you in the area as that's the composer?
Well, the ones who know me, know me as a composer.
Yeah.
And we have had a pretty active classical music scene through the college. Some of my colleagues have been astonishingly entrepreneurial, so there's a kind of an awareness now that wasn't here when I moved here 20 years ago of
Yeah.
classical music. And so, yeah, when I meet people, sometimes they want to know, do you know the conductor of that orchestra that runs that series? And yeah, that's my friend, is my colleague for 20 years. It means that people actually, in a small population, a surprising percentage have had a chance to hear my music.
Right, yeah.
So at the same time, I think most composers don't want to have a career that's based on a local experience. So it's been really important for me to get to the cities as much as possible. And I think of my composing career as being centered in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
and with some small bits of it in New York City that I've tried to keep going since I was there in the mid-'80s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's sort of a weight that an artist can provide in a smaller community. In a city, you can feel like you do all these projects, but you don't really feel the impact of it.
Well,
in a town, suddenly it can be like anything you do has a more significant presence.
you would hope. I think that the problem is that the kind of music that we do is not at the center of American consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's hard to make an impact or a difference. And it's hard to feel like you're standing on a solid foundation.
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes envy my European friends who, at achieving a certain level of success, are they're going to get gold medals from their government.
Yeah.
And it's not something that's restricted just to Aaron Copland and John Adams, but more. There's this sense that culture is valued. I spent a year living in England, and every small town had a Shakespeare theater.
Uh-huh.
And the composers all went to London, but there was this sense when, let's say, a new piece by Michael Tippett was being played, there was a line around the block.
Mm-hmm.
People, talk about where they were when they first heard A Child of Our Time, and the impact it had on their lives, and in a way that doesn't really happen even in the big cities, where there is so much culture.
Mm.
But it's the life we have. So, and I'm not complaining about it. It is what it is, and I feel incredibly lucky to be able to write music for good people to play.
You can't complain.
No, there's nothing to complain about. Terrific musicians playing, the sometimes stupidly challenging music.
Have your goals or expectations changed as your career developed?
So
So we're talking about like that. Other people I know they can achieve towards getting a medal from the government or having that recognition, and the avenues are really different between Europe and America.
Right. I mean, everybody who's in their 20s that wants to be a composer has a level of ambition and a curiosity about how they are going to fit into the world of composition.
Yeah.
And so everybody's got their ultimate goals, and their would be great if I could achieve them goals, and would be satisfied if I could only get this goals. And mostly what you want to do is to figure out that there is a way to support yourself where your primary intellectual energy is going towards composing. Not saying all of your time goes to composing. So for a lot of us, it's finding a teaching position. Mm-hmm. Where we can teach music, and we can teach composition, and things like counterpoint and orchestration, and even music theory. Or even when we teach general music classes, that we have the opportunity to bring our passion for music to a general audience, with the idea that the people who go off and become doctors and lawyers are going to want to keep arts in their life. Mm-hmm. And that's rewarding.
Yeah.
So I think that, but this wondering if you can make it to the upper echelons, everybody has that wonder, of course. I'm sure as a saxophonist, you look at the most successful people and say, well, they did it. Why can't I? And how did they get there?
Oh, yeah.
What was it that allowed them to,
Yeah, it's kind of crazy in some way. It's like going to acting school and wanting to be a movie star.
Right. And well, there's that Stephen Sondheim song, "Another 100 people got off of the train." Everyone comes to New York, and I still remember this feeling I had when I arrived in New York in my late 20s to start a doctorate program at Columbia, and I had this tiny apartment, one-room studio.
Oh, yeah.
with a view of an air shaft.
Uh-huh.
And at this time, the Upper West Side, this part of the Upper West Side, I moved there in '79, was between 96 and 110 was called no man's land, because it was a transitional area in terms of economics. Now it's all gentrified, but so we were just careful late at night, to walk on the west side of Broadway instead of the east side of Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
But in this tiny little apartment, one of 23 apartments on the 15th floor of a 23 story building,
Yeah.
And in the Upper West Side at that time, there were probably 15% of the people in there musicians, and the next building over looked the same and had as many musicians, and the next building over looked the same.
Yeah.
On the other hand, some of the successful musicians lived fairly nearby. Charles Warren was around the corner. Bernstein was less than a mile away. Lillian Kalir, the pianist, was living nearby, and we'd run into them in the grocery store.
Yeah.
And so there was something very exciting about that, and it indicated a couple of things. One is that no matter how successful you are, you're still going to shop in the same grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've always thought that, like, as a saxophonist, for the most part, I could get as famous as possible and probably still just walk around and not get mobbed by anybody.
Well, unless you're Branford Marsalis.
Yeah.
But he's not going to get mobbed in if he came to Southern Maryland. Nobody would recognize him.
Yeah.
Some people might. But the getting mobbed like a movie star.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen to most classical musicians.
Right.
I think it used to happen to Bernstein, but only because he traveled with a kind of entourage, which was he walked down the street and the people around him were almost announcing, this is an important person.
Yeah. Everyone goes, do I know that person? Should I know that person?
Yes, and he was able to stand on the street in such a way that he looked incredible. There's a famous picture of him in an elevator. Now, who looks good in an elevator? He looks like he's carrying the weight of the world. So.
I don't know this picture. I have to check it out.
Yeah, it's very cool. He looks deeply depressed.
Oh man.
Where was this going? Yeah, how the goals changed. I think what happens is when you get to a place where you think of yourself as middle-aged. I had this conversation with a number of friends who were trying to get their careers going about the same time I was, and they've gotten teaching positions. Some of them are still composing. Some of them have become more successful. Some less.
Yeah.
But we'll talk to each other, and at a certain point you say, look, the career is what it is. There's none of this I could have been or I should have been. I've got, some people I was students at the same time with have gone on to massive careers. At Columbia University, when I was working on my doctorate, Paul Moravec was working on his master's, and he's got a Pulitzer Prize. When I went to Aspen, David Lang was one of the students, and I think it's just terrific what's happened to those guys. They've worked for it and they've earned it, and but there's a lot of good music being written by a lot of really interesting people, and we're each contributing as we can.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain kind of personality and drive that have to mesh and mix in a little bit of good luck. And but mostly very, very hard work, and deciding that that's what you want more than anything else. And maybe I didn't have that kind of fire in the belly. But I've done fine. I'm very happy with my career. And as I said, I get to write challenging music for really great players. I get to have a nice life. Orchestras play my music sometimes. I have CD once in a while, and you look back over a life, and you've got I got a publisher I'm happy with. And the music's out there, and the recordings are there. You can find my stuff on Spotify and Nexus, and
it's really easy as a musician to hyper focus on something and forget about 2 months ago I did this awesome thing, and
right.
I should still be happy about that.
Well, when I was doing my master's degree at University of Southern California, one of the things that the professors there let me do was whenever we had guest composers come through, which was maybe every other week or so, they'd come and give a talk, and then the faculty would take them out to lunch. And the chair of the department liked me and said, "Hey, David, come along." So I'd go out to lunch with these guys, and having just heard them talk, and it would be some very famous people and some people who didn't have huge careers. And I started asking myself, which ones of these guys are happy? Not who's got the most.
Yeah.
Who's had the biggest career, who had the most performances, whose music has been played by Berlin and Philharmonic. It was, which ones of these guys are happy? And I was trying to figure out from among the happy ones what they had in common. And in almost every case, the happy ones had something else besides music that was equally important at the center of their lives. Sometimes it was a church, sometimes it was family. Most often it was family.
Yeah.
You know, and if that part of life is really good, then everything else is just kind of like, you know, it's frosting on the cake. And then what happens happens.
Yeah.
I think looking back to where I was when I arrived in New York and what I wanted to happen, you know, there was, of course, you know, is it possible for, you know, to get to the highest levels? And you know, I tried for a while, but the next level, it would be really great if I think I've achieved that. You know, I get to live a life of comfort, and I get to write music, and I get to hear it performed, and
Yeah.
and what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
So the rest of it will sort itself out.
Well, we were just working on your piece, Flying High, and I want to talk a little bit about your music and the way you write. That piece, the first thing that jumps out practicing it is that it's very rhythmic, and then has these tonal centers that are tonal. It's
More or less.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no dominant tonic relationship.
Right.
But there are the things that are somewhat analogous to that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely not 12-tone music.
Yeah.
But I think of myself as a Schoenbergian trained composer who prefers to work with groups of pitches that make, generally speaking, make a kind of more consonant sound. Early Berg in particular I find very interesting. But also what I took from the Schoenbergian idea was the idea that music develops continuously. And I think that that's probably true of Flying High, that there's this kind of line going. You can always see where it's going, and you can hear things come back, but they come back transformed. Little ideas are continuously buried.
Yeah, I think I heard in another interview you said something about like you wanted your music to feel like it was sometimes surprising, but always went where it's meant to go.
Yeah, that was a quote I stole from Roger Sessions.
Oh.
He gave a series of lectures at Harvard that were published as questions about music. And in one of the lectures, actually in a couple of the lectures, he talked about creating a set of criteria for judging musical quality. He understood it was an audacious thing to do, but it didn't stop him. In fact, one composer I know that I have a lot of respect for, Alexander Gur, once told me that he asked how I decide if my basic material is any good. And I said, well, you can't answer that question because, you know, it's what you do with it, it's the development. And I gave him some examples, you know, Beethoven, the Belly Variations, all these pieces, a banal idea that's developed into something magnificent. He said, no, those are the exceptions. How do you decide if your basic material is, I guess, well, look, it's not a question anyone can answer, so why ask it? And he stared at me intently and said, it's the only interesting question. So, after my jaw came back up off the ground, I've been chewing on that thought for now almost 30 years.
Has that given you like writer's block?
No.
I feel like if you got swallowed up by that, you'd be writing a piece and then stop and be like, is this even worth continuing?
Well, but that's a question actually that I think he noticed I wasn't asking often enough. I got a lot more liberal about throwing things away. But what it meant was that I needed to make decisions for myself. Is this any good? And if I couldn't honestly tell myself that it was any good, I'd throw it away. because just because I wrote it down doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, once I've decided that it's good, I have to allow myself to go with that idea, and then I have to compose the way that feels right to me, which is this, as I said, a kind of a Schoenbergian notion of continuous development.
Mm-hmm.
But it's one of my teachers. I've studied with a couple of Schoenberg scholars, Schoenberg students. One of them was not a composer but a theorist, Patricia Carpenter at Columbia, and she studied tonal theory with Schoenberg. He was a brilliant tonal theorist, but didn't leave enough material written about it. So it mostly was carried forward by his students. There have been some people that have worked on developing his ideas, particularly Severin Neff has put out some books that took many of Schoenberg's notes and ideas for books and actually completed them. But for a long time, you had to get it from one of his students. And what I learned from her is that the connection between Schoenberg, the theorist who studied Beethoven and wrote about Beethoven and talked about Beethoven and what Beethoven was doing, and the composer who wrote 12-tone music. And the line became at least clear to me, and not that I care to make sure everyone else understands it, but it works for me. And this idea that that a piece of music will take a fairly simple idea. I think the fairly simple idea in Flying High is there's a 12-note gesture that opens the piece, a little 12-note tune that kind of encompasses, it encompasses all of the melodic intervallic ideas. It encompasses the primary harmonic material, the rhythmic gestures, and then it became, okay, what do I do with this thing? And then, repeat it, but slightly different. Let it grow somewhere else. Try it upside down. Try it sideways, backwards. Try to interpolate things. Try to create longer range goals that are sometimes based on another way of looking at. Let's say the opening gesture is going up a half step. My two cadential gestures are both going down a half step. And they're moved in a completely different rhythmic and harmonic context, but that kind of unity across the piece, where all generated from that first 12-note gesture. Now, now you're sitting and writing it out and making sure it all connects.
Yeah.
No, it's after you do that when you're starting, and then you just sort of trust your ear. But that also came from Schoenberg. Schoenberg wrote in an article that was published in Style and Idea, the collection of his writings. He talked about the experience of writing intuitively, seeing analytically that things didn't belong together, but leaving them in because they sounded good, and then discovering 10 years later that there was a connection. So it was composed by ear, trust your ear. But then use your brain to figure it out, and eventually you'll make that connection.
When you're starting a composition, do you write at piano, or do you play something by ear to build material?
I used to do it all at the piano, and then when computer technology came along, it was nice to be able to step away from the piano and have the computer play it. As computer technology got better. But there's also something really visceral about having your hands on top of the notes.
Yeah.
And I am a pianist, so this feeling that I've got it under my hands, and that so I sort of go back and forth. I usually start at the piano. I write typically write with pencil. Lately, what I've been doing is I'll write maybe the opening material and some of the first stretching out of it. I won't sit down to compose until I've got that pretty clear in my head, and plus a sort of overall sense of what the piece is going to do.
Okay.
Then I'll write that down, make sure I'm happy with it at the piano, and then I'll put it into the computer. And then I'll print out the computer notation, plus another 50 blank measures. And I'll take that over to the piano, and I'll write a few more measures. I'll put them in,
Oh, cool.
and then, so it's this back and forth, walking back and forth between my computer and the piano, playing it at the piano, then the computer play it, singing it, taking in the shower, going for a walk, trying to get my head, well, when you're in the middle of a piece, it sort of stays with you everywhere.
Yeah.
And then suddenly ideas pop, and you can go back and put them in.
Mm-hmm.
But most of it is just the hard work of, what if it does this, and then you realize that doesn't work, so you throw it away and you try something else. And this kind of, I love this line in Raiders of the Lost Ark, this movie, the Spielberg.
Yeah.
There's a moment in the film, it's a very carefully made film with all of these kind of cross connections, the whips and snakes and fire, and each one is a separate motif developed independently, and then that scene in the snake pit, when they're squirting lighter fluid and setting the snakes on fire and he's using his whip, it's like everything comes together.
That's awesome.
It's one of these most carefully constructed movies, but at one point somebody asks Harrison Ford what's going to happen next, and he says, I don't know, I'm just making this up as I go along. So, and I think that's what, we were talking about that earlier, this sense that you want something that's constructed carefully to be, to give the impression that it's improvised.
Mm-hmm.
So you want never to lose that connection to the improvisatory spirit, the kind of spark of imagination that spits out, that manifests itself in musical ideas.
Yeah.
But then you want to stop and think about it and say, well, could that have been better? Mm-hmm. We're not all Charlie Parker. Where what just comes flying out of him at amazing speed is something that is worthy of deep study, or like Mozart,
mm-hmm.
where the piece is basically completely written in his head, and then he just writes it down. So it's much more for the mortals, a kind of an exploration, and the exploration is part of the pleasure. You try something, it doesn't work, you try something else, that works fine, and then you move on and you go back and look at what you've done, and if you can figure out a more interesting way to make it work, then that's better. And a lot of trust in your own instincts, but your own instincts honed by, they're not really instincts, they're more learned responses, honed by years of doing analytical study and developing compositional craft.
Is that something that you feel happened mostly after school?
I
feel like I've grown a lot after school when you have to do it on your own, and
it just happens with age. And I think without school it would happen if you just forced yourself to keep working.
Yeah.
I think that music is astonishingly difficult. That I like to remind my students that even a genius like Mozart took about 10 to 12 years of composing before he was really good. The music that he wrote after he'd been composing for 10 to 12 years, say around the time he was 15 to 17, it starts to reach a much higher level. And of course he started at 5, and he hit that very high level of these magnificent masterpieces at the age of 15 or 17.
Yeah.
But it even took Mozart 10 years.
Yeah. That's like the 10,000 hour rule.
Yeah, and it's the same with, I remember reading a study where they asked music teachers to predict, at top conservatories, to predict who among their students was going to be successful, and then they tracked, and they were trying to get, what's the basic talent, and then they looked at the most successful people in terms of, how much of a career they had, and they found the only thing they had in common was how many hours they practiced. It was more than everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever think about doing another profession, or if there were times when you thought music wouldn't work out?
I have been lucky enough to have been involved with music at the center since about my junior year of college. I started as a physics major and I considered maybe math instead, because I liked math a little bit better than I liked physics. But then started taking music courses from really brilliant people, and it just blew my mind.
Did you? I mean, I assume you learned music before that.
Yeah, I'd taken piano
Piano
lessons,
lessons.
like everybody. You know, you take lessons on it. I played saxophone, I played violin. I had this kind of restless musical spirit. I wanted to, I wanted to play saxophone because I wanted to play in bands.
Oh yeah.
Because at least in the little town I grew up, the bands made a better sound than the orchestras did. But I played in youth orchestras. Playing violin was just too hard. And I was taking piano lessons the whole time. But landing in composing was my discovery that as an instrumentalist, I had to practice continuously. I can remember a moment where I was actually pretty good at the saxophone. But 3 days later it was gone.
It stinks.
Yeah. And,
it's the worst.
But with composing, once I've drawn a double bar, the piece stays composed.
Yeah.
So I thought, damn, this is the way to go.
Does composing slide back like that? If you don't write a piece for a month, does
No.
it feel weird?
No.
Not so much.
I go long stretches without composing. I've been a department chair,
Yeah.
so my composing has dwindled. But I find that
Does it creep out if you're not writing? 'Cause if I don't practice, I'll start humming or something. When I'm
not
walking
so
on the
much.
street, like I
because
feel like it spills out in some
It's
way.
usually I'm too busy doing other things.
Yeah.
But what I've discovered is that I can work intently on a piece. I have to make sure that I put it down mid-phrase. I can't put it down. at
I've
the
heard
end.
that trick.
So
I think I heard that from a writer that would do that. You'd
Yeah.
stop like mid-story, mid-paragraph.
Yeah, and I learned this from a wonderful teacher at the University of Southern California, a composer named Robert Lynn, who was a far better and more successful, a far better composer than his success level indicated. He had some successes, but he was a brilliant composer. He didn't have that kind of burning ambition. But he was also one of the happiest people I knew. And we were talking about this happiness thing. But he told me, he was a very productive composer, and he discovered when I was studying with him that I would come to the end of the page and I'd stop. And he said, never stop on the end of the page. He said, turn the page, write at least one more measure.
Yeah.
So I would do that, and then I found myself filling up that page, and then I had to write one more measure. But
So you just keep going.
yeah, so I've learned how not to write myself into a hole.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, for instance, I finished up a piece over this Christmas break, and it was something I was working on in the summer. I got to the point where I had to put it down because I got busy doing other things, and it was in the middle of a song, in the middle of a phrase, and as a piece for soprano and violin. When I found the time to get back to it, it was as if I had never left it. So maybe it's just that, that's just my personality. I can do that. I can compartmentalize.
Mm.
I can put something off on the back burner and it doesn't scorch back there or burn away.
That's nice.
Yeah, it is nice. So that's what I do. I could be more ambitious. I could write more, but
Well, it seems like the kind of thing that you have to sort of learn how you get engaged with it. So
Right.
if it's not the right time, or if you have something else that your brain's focused on,
right.
sort of finding out how to manage yourself.
Well, you can spoil yourself by, for instance, insisting that you have to have the whole day clear. You have to have a cup of coffee in the morning, and everything has to be neat.
That's the extreme, yeah.
Yeah, and when I was in graduate school, I could do that. But, I can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So now it's a matter of, I find that I can't compose in the afternoon after having done a bunch of other things. But so after my kids are off at school or engaged in their morning activities, and everyone's eaten and
Mm-hmm.
up and around, if my morning is clear, then I can go compose. And
Yeah.
so I mean, everybody finds the best way to work. A couple of times I've been at artist colonies. I'll fall into this habit of, you know, just wasting the entire morning, but then composing through the afternoon.
Right.
We should probably wrap this up.
Yeah, your family's arriving. I know you have stuff to do. So
Yeah.
thank you for spending the time with us.
Thank you.
All right.